Just make maybe a half a dozen. Just need headshots or waist up or something like that. I need those to make a thumbnail for the video. So you're going already on this? Is that right?
on.
Everything set?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
You got the red marks blinking?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, this is the October meeting of the Native American Fellowship, and our program tonight is first in a series of 3 programs on the Kiowas. We may or may not do them sequentially, but we got 3 potential programs here. This is from a paper that I did when I was living in Philadelphia, working for Farm Journal and going to the University of Pennsylvania part-time. And I did this paper on the Kiowa Indian tribe. And I started it out with an ethno-history of the Kiowas, Kiowa tribe. And then the major part of it was Kiowa folk tales that I had collected from a Kiowa friend of mine. And the second and third portions of this program, if we get around to those at future meetings, will be, first of all, the second one would be a paper on the presenter, the Indian. His English name was Dewey Gumbai. His actual Kiowa name was Agum, A-H-G-O-O-M, and that had become anglicized to Gumbai. And he's the one that started writing to me when I was in high school at age 15. I was a sophomore, 1950, and I got this letter from him because I'd asked for pen pals in Farm and Ranch magazine. And he and I became pen pals, and we remained pen pals and friends. We visited each other after I became an adult several times. And we became close friends, and until we were friends until he died. But during that period of time, when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, I interviewed him for these Kiowa folktales, and to do the paper on it, I felt that I needed to do this first part of it, which I call an ethno-history of the Kiowa tribe. And this is kind of the introduction. And I'll just give that tonight with your permission. The Kiowa tribe is a product of the Great American Prairie, commonly known as the Plains. This inhospitable area was considered uninhabitable even by the red man until the coming of the horse to the North American continent some 3 centuries ago. When Indians on the fringe of the plains mounted the horse en masse, they changed something more than an extension of their buffalo hunts. This development, the coming of the horse, literally created the Plains Indians. These newly mounted hunters and warriors borrowed a culture here, another there, whatever fitted the exigencies of the new situation. Eventually, the last primitive culture to be formed in America was evolved. It was the horse culture of the Plains Indians. It was a harsh culture, predatory and hostile against other Indians as well as whites. 31 tribes contributed to this unique development of Plains Indians culture, which there was sufficient spontaneity and homogeneity springing up among 11 of those tribes to create the typical Plains culture. And those were, I'm not sure I can pronounce all of them because some of them I'm really not familiar with. It looks like you would pronounce this Anaboins, Arapahoes, Blackfeet, Cheyennes, Comanches, Crows. I think this one is Gros Ventres, Sarsis, Teton Dakotas, Kiowa Apaches, and the Kiowas. So they were America's nomadic Indians. They moved constantly from camp to camp, taking all their belongings and supplies on horse-drawn travois, they called them. In the 1890s, James Mooney, making his ethnographic study for the Smithsonian, found Indians who recalled having lived from the northern plains and the mountains of the Black Hills to the sources of the Yellowstone and the Missouri rivers. Amazingly, stories were also collected which describe a Plains Indian expedition as far south as British Honduras. At length, however, they covered their raiding operations in and around the Wichita Mountains and the Ouachita River in Oklahoma, but they considered their area to extend at least from Mexico and southern Texas to the northern plains. The southern parties of the area was controlled for the most part by Kiowas, Comanches, and Kiowa Apaches. Of all the Plains Indians, the Kiowas not only had the most horses per person, but they were foremost in possessing the character traits associated with this new culture: bravery, predatism, and sheer audacity. Their usual weapons were bow and arrow, lance, and tomahawk. To make circular war shields, the Kiowas cut rawhide from the neck of the buffalo and hardened it by fire. Of course, they eventually obtained guns from the Spanish and from the Anglo-Americans. The clothing of the Kiowas betrayed the nomadic habits. Men wore moccasins, breechclouts, shirts. Women wore boot moccasins and dresses, all made of deerskin. Children wore nothing until 3 or 4 years old, and then they wore scaled-down adult clothing. Both sexes and all ages wore winter robes of buffalo or deerskin. The Kiowa also had a penchant for ornaments: metal, shell, beadwork. Actually, there were 6 Kiowa bands or sub-tribes, each with its own chief, subject to overall leadership of the tribe's head chief. Each band had distinct social classes within them, and their rank was obtained in those largely through military exploits, religious power, and wealth. Paramount in the scheme were the war dancing societies, which were males joined those at maturity. Women were always subservient to men. They performed all menial chores for an encampment. They took care of the men's war equipment. They accompanied them to the buffalo hunt to skin the animals and pack the horses for the meat. Pack the meat home on horses, in other words. Even took care of the horses most of the time. So there were a few manly-hearted, ambitious, defiant female exceptions who broke the rules from these restrictions. Usually physically handsome types, the women often owned property and even showed independence in sexual matters. Interestingly, they were favored wives, sometimes called the sit-by wife. 2 methods of marriages existed among the Kiowas. The first called for the boy's parents to pay an agreed-upon number of horses to the bride's parents. If for some reason an impasse arose, the couple might just elope. As a rule, young marrieds lived with the wife's people until they could set up their own teepee. Polygamy was usual for the chiefs and warriors because of the high male mortality. Further, chiefs and warriors usually had more material possessions than others in the tribes, hence the need for more women to maintain the holdings. As a rule, a man with more than one wife tried to pick sisters in an effort to promote peaceful domestic harmony among the wives. However, monogamy was quite common, if for no other reason than its economy. certain men's societies initiated a legitimized practice of what they call stealing other men's wives, just for a few days at a time. Sex was generally regarded with a curious ambivalence. For example, chastity was highly valued, so Kiowa males presented as a matter of course. They sought to dishonor other females. Now, divorce was relatively easy, but not very common. If a woman wished to leave her husband, she needed only to obtain the consent of her brother. However, an adulterous woman was usually abandoned on the prairie with her nose cut off after being raped by members of one of the soldier societies. The Kiowas cared well for their children, teaching and rewarding them rather than punishing or correcting. Crying was not tolerated. Babies learned not to do it. Children were regarded as individuals in a very real sense. History, religion, and other tribal lore was taught to them daily. Stories of the men's war exploits were told upon their return from raids. Bedtime stories about Trickster, that's a capital T, a mythical figure, were told, involved instruction and entertainment about the trickster. Further, Kaga children were instructed most diligently in good manners and respect for elders. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they learned to walk. Tribes were recognized with, that word is proud. By the way, I'm reading from a carbon copy made with a manual typewriter, and it's pretty dim here, so some of these words aren't sticking out real clear to me. Prowess was recognized with public praise and tangible rewards, usually ponies. At the age of 12 or 13, boys were old enough to join the hunt or the war parties, and here they learned from the older men. Many of the important families and favorite children, the term that they used was usually some were pampered by the entire family and often by the entire tribe, favored children. Such a favored child received larger portions of material wealth than the others. Chief Satank's name was anglicized to Sitting Bear. Chief Satank's favorite son was killed while raiding in Texas, and his father was so distressed and grieved that he made a special trip to retrieve his son's bones. And this caused consternation in the tribe, since a dead body was supposed to be approached only to lay it out for final rites. Actually, Chief Satank later laid out the bones in his son's teepee and carried them with him wherever he traveled, wrapped in a blanket on his son's horse. Creation myths seem to be scarce among the Kiowas, but according to one, their first ancestors were summoned from a hollow cottonwood log by the great Kiowa. That's great capital Kiowa. Sort of like the Great Spirit, I suppose. The more important religious ceremony was the Kaga, or the sun dance, staged to obtain power from the sun, one of the many powerful Kiowa spirit forces. The sun dance came to the Kiowa from an Arapaho by intermarriage. His descendants were the keepers of the Taime, that's T-A-I-M-E, Taime. Sacred images used during the sun dance last held in 1887. Other objects of veneration were the grandmothers, that's a capital G, the grandmothers. Religious bundles. The grandmothers were little religious bundles. They were not actually people, but they were called the grandmothers. Considered the Eucharistic division of their supernatural hero, Sun Boy. Okay, These objects are still in existence, although the last known Kiowa who had the sacred right to open them for inspection died in the 1890s. A number of religious societies once dominated our culture, Kiowa culture. There was crazy dogs, known as the Great Warriors, the Buffalo Doctors for the treatment of wounds, the Owl Doctors for prophecy and for the finding of lost articles, the Eagle Shields, who were the shamans for commonly used their powers for good, and the Sundance Shields, whose duty was to guard the Time, or the Sundance image, and its keeper. Membership in the religious societies was by invitation only, and acceptance of an invitation was mandatory. In 1881 and 1882, the Kiowa prophet Datakan began to preach the return of the buffalo philosophy. But after 10 days and nights of ceremonial prayer failed to produce the animals, he charged lack of faith. Datakan lost faith and died within a year. In 1883, missionary work began with the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Mennonites, the Baptists, and the Catholics establishing missions. Again in 1887, Painge, a medicine man, revived the doctrine of the return of the buffalo and the good old days. This caused a great deal of excitement. He developed a following until Joshua Gibbon, the son of Satanic, and an educated missionary, challenged him to attempt to rise from the dead after 3 days. Big challenge. The challenge was declined, and his influence disappeared. During 1890, the great dance, these light carbons are getting the best of me. During 1890, the ghost dance religion came to the Kiowas. This religion taught that the earth was to be renewed and the dead relatives were to be resurrected. There would be no white men, only Indians, living happily as before, although free from death, free from misery, free from disease. The magic of the ghost dance would carry them into the renewed land. The peyote ritual, patterned upon the Christian teachings, involved chewing peyote buttons and blossoms, a practice which induced sleep and colored dreams. Actually, James Mooney helped the Indians develop the peyote cult, and as a result, he was recalled and forbidden to visit them again. The Kiowas made their first treaty with the United States government as the Medicine Lodge Creek Council, held in Kansas, October of 1867. But not all chiefs signed this treaty, and it was unsuccessful. United States authorities wanted the Indians to retreat to reservations, while the Indians wanted to remain free. Imagine that. After the Civil War ended, however, the government began to pour in troops and equipment with the obvious goal of subjugating the Indians. Little more than a year after the treaty at Medicine Creek, Generals Custer and Sheridan were destroying Kiowas and Cheyennes all along the Washita River. In 1871, the Kiowa massacred the Warren wagon train in Texas after hearing that a railroad was to be built across their old hunting grounds. This focused national attention on the Indian problem. The golden age of the Plains Indian, the era of the horse culture, was nearly gone. It lasted for barely a century, roughly from 1775 to 1875. Not all the Plains tribes were settled by 1875, but the buffalo were practically gone by then, and the Indians' horses were taken from them. And for the Kiowas, Indians were on the southern plains. Their time was over. Kicking Bird brought the last band into Fort Sill Reservation, and the chiefs were sent to prison in Florida. With the settling of the Kiowa on reservations, the Indian Department tried unsuccessfully to impose agriculture on them. The inherent cultural change was simply too drastic. The Indians said they did not want their women working in the fields. And of course, it was unthinkable for the men to do such work. However, some Indians did build up herds of cattle, and there were other problems. For instance, white cattlemen wanted to graze their Indians on Indian land. In 1885, a Kiowa delegation went to Washington, D.C. to secure official approval to rent their own lands. Finally, in 1892, a government commission negotiated allotments. Each Indian, young or old, got 160 acres of land. All told, 2,759 Kiowas got 443,338 acres. Unallotted land was sold by lottery to the public. In addition, the government agreed to pay the Kiowas $2 million in installments of $500,000 each to draw 5% interest in the United States Treasury. Today, the Kiowas are generally rural people. Their homes are modern, well cared for. Some have gained wealth from the discovery of oil. Most of the Kiowas are Christians, predominantly Methodist and Baptist. The Kiowa Comanche Apache Intertribal Business Committee has 12 members who make recommendations to the Indian office. This committee, which has 5 Kiowa members, is influential in matters relating to the tribes. The Constitution provides for monthly meetings at Anadarko, Oklahoma, and members are elected every 4 years. Most of the Kiowas, even the younger people, still speak their own language as well as English. The Indians still remember the songs of the old days and sing them at home when they are working or resting. Everyone has an Indian name as well as an English name. Every child knows the history of his tribe as his grandfather has told it to him. P.S. My Indian name given to me by Dewey Goombai, or Dewey Agun, was Tahanatali. But you've heard me talk about that before. That's the end of the program for tonight.
Did he tell you what your name meant?
Yeah,
Why did he give it to you?
Texan boy.
Texas boy.
He gave my granddaughter a name too. When my granddaughter was 5 years old and getting ready to start to kindergarten, I figured, you know, that I won't be around her as much. You know, I won't have her with me as much, and I need to get her up there and get her an Indian name. So I took her up there, and
Anadarko?
no, they lived at Mountain View, which is near Anadarko. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I did manage to get her an Indian, a Kiowa name before she started kindergarten. Anyway, that's the program for tonight. Thanks to Ed for doing the video, and to Ellie for doing the
Come on, good.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
That was interesting.
So I'm going to turn this off.